I call Claire Curran.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Labor will support this bill to Select Committee. In principle, we consider that the objectives of this bill are sound. Nothing is more important than keeping our families and communities safe. Our civil defence services must be ready to respond effectively to any emergency, and we must all be prepared for emergencies before they happen. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. The 4 R's, as they're described, the risk reduction, readiness, response and recovery, are the backbone of our civil defence planning, and with effective coordination and integration, they should provide robust protection and preparation for civil defence emergencies. They look good on paper. We have to make sure that they work in practice. Civil defence people do important work, put themselves into some very difficult and dangerous, sometimes dangerous situations after an emergency, and we've got to make sure that they have appropriate powers and abilities to do their job correctly. As I said, we will support this bill to Select Committee. We do have some concerns about the scope of the new powers and as to how robust this bill will be when put into practice. I note that this is the first of 2 bills signalled by the Minister, Nikki Kay, and my remarks relate to notes of caution. Some of the notes of caution and the signals and signal that there are areas that don't appear to be covered under this proposed legislation. This is the first major amendment to the 2002 CDEM Act. Therefore, it should provide an opportunity to overhaul a 2002 Act using recent case studies of disasters requiring a civil defence response. However, the legislative review from which this bill was born had a mandate to only look at emergency recovery, and I referred to the 4 R's. Well, this is only one of them, the last one, recovery. And certainly emergency recovery was an area that needed addressing. However, we feel that taking just one component of this framework runs the risk of undermining the purpose of the 2002 Act, and may make difficult to implement in practice. Recovery, planning and training is vital, but it also has to work alongside the other 3 components and not in isolation. So a wider review of that current legislation should take place in order to provide holistic and clear legislative support to local government alongside the other 3 R's. We support the inclusion of the national and local transition periods in the effort to make the move from the response to the recovery phase more cohesive. But, Mr Speaker, when the response phase is already hindered, as was the case in Dunedin in June, the implementation of a local or a national transition period will be futile for short-term recovery. We also support the establishment of a permanent legislative authority in managing Crown financing and reimbursing of civil defence emergencies. The PLA, as this is called, we hope that that will be fair and equitable in the allocation of Crown funding for emergencies. For example, it took 2 days for the government to announce an initial cash injection of $250,000 for Wanganui in June, with a further $2.6 million pledged 2 months later. By contrast, it took 2 weeks for Dunedin to receive a $100,000 cash injection from the government, the only one that it would receive in the ongoing recovery effort. On the surface, the 2 events might not be comparable. However, the regional context is very different for both areas, and the tendency for condensed, low-lying housing in the South Dunedin area has meant that the social cost of those June floods have been absolutely devastating. Those costs have been estimated from insurance purposes to be well over $30 million, but the true social costs will never be known because there's no counting of that. So what happens, Mr. Speaker, when current legislation fails, and what will this bill really do to ensure that those failures are remedied? And I think that's a really important question for the Select Committee to answer and to look at some real case studies. I know there are a number of them. A core, as the Minister who spoke before me mentioned, a core CDEM principle is to act locally, coordinate regionally, support nationally. But what happens when local authorities do not act? What happens when they miscalculate the enormity of a disaster and refuse to declare a local state of emergency? In the case of the Dunedin floods, the 4 R's failed. The risk was not reduced, the city was not ready, the response was woefully inadequate, and the recovery is ongoing and costly. Local government had been provided with multiple warnings of the flood risk in South Dunedin due to a high water table. We have the recent report from the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment to provide really solid evidence from that, but there certainly was solid evidence available to the public and to the local government before that. Yet nothing was done to reduce the risk. So where was the oversight there? The city was not ready. Local civil defence authorities were left floundering for evacuation points and volunteer bases, with notes from the first briefing of the emergency EOC saying the question was, where do we assemble people in South Dunedin? And it was left to a local marine search and rescue group to set up a volunteer base at St Kilda. And I personally had to call the Civil Defence Minister at midnight to put pressure on her to get some kind of response. That was not her fault. That was the issue that was not being addressed in South Dunedin, in Dunedin at the time by local authorities and by Civil Defence. Most of all, the response effort was woefully inadequate because no state of emergency was declared in Dunedin on June the 3rd. Mr. Speaker, in response to my request as to why a state of emergency was not called in South Dunedin, Dunedin Civil Defence responded that at no time did emergency services indicate that the situation was beyond their capabilities. On that day alone, the fire service received 289 calls compared with 20 calls in total the previous Wednesday. They were so stretched that their multiple incident procedure policy, MIP, had to be activated, and that is only triggered when the ComCen was not able to cope with the workload and may necessitate the reduction of fire service responses to incidents. The police, fire and ambulance services had all units committed at peak time during that flood event. And to top it off, Dunedin Civil Defence closed their operations at 11:30 p.m, which was despite more than 30 of the most vulnerable citizens residing at a local rest home having to contend with constant sewage leaks and power outages. And on it went. The response from local civil defence authorities fell markedly short, and this set back any meaningful recovery efforts. Had a local state of emergency been declared, the story would almost certainly have been different, but it wasn't, and South Dunedin is still suffering because of it. Mr. Speaker, the Dunedin floods story shows that although the 4 R's legislative framework might look good on paper, in practice it is another matter. So more effort is needed to ensure that local government is both supported and held to account for its work in emergency management. And while it's good that the recommendations included in the regulatory impact statement have been included in this bill, their effectiveness is significantly reduced if the 4 R's model is not working as a whole. And it's all very well to have robust recovery measures, but if the local response falls short, then they are in essence meaningless. So in considering this bill at Select Committee, these matters need to be taken into account.
I call Sarah Dowie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.